Psalm 31, Joshua 7 and 8, Acts 15. You should know it. You should be reading it. You should hopefully be out of your turkey coma by now if you ate way too much food yesterday. And this morning, I want to just spend a little bit of time with you in chapter 15 of the book of Acts. And I want to set the stage a little bit. So the Jerusalem Council is what's happening here in Acts 15. And the reason why they have to have this council in Jerusalem is because all over the Roman Empire now, there are these little churches springing up, and many of them are filled with Gentiles. And these Gentiles, these non-Jewish believers in Jesus, were being told by some groups that you need Jesus, but you also need to obey the whole Old Testament law to be saved. If you don't do that, then Jesus won't save you. And so what is happening here is all of the disciples have gotten together to have this debate, this argument, this discussion about whether or not the Gentiles should be held to this standard, whether or not the Church of Christ should be held to this standard. And ultimately, after much debate, Peter stands up, and Peter says in verse 10, "Now therefore, why are you putting God to the test by placing a yoke on the neck of the disciples that neither our fathers nor we have been able to bear?" In other words, everything that you've been reading in the Old Testament, from Genesis through Joshua, where we're at now, you have seen over and over again that the Israelites have failed to obey all of God's law. And so Peter's argument begins there. Why are you trying to place on these Gentiles a law that none of us have been able to fulfill? And the very reason that Jesus had to come was because none of us were able to fulfill the law perfectly. What are you trying to do to them? He continues in verse 11, and he says, "We believe that we will be saved through the grace of the Lord Jesus, just as they will." And all the assembly fell silent. In other words, there's nothing else to say. This is the truth of the gospel, is that no, you don't need to have all of this extra law. There are things that we as believers must do, but not because the Old Testament commands them, but because the nature of God and the nature of wanting to be like God draws us into living our life in a way that glorifies Him. That's not what saves us. That's not what transforms us from death to life. That's just the way that someone who's in love with Jesus begins to live. And so that's what Peter's arguing here in the Jerusalem Council. I hope you read that. I hope you're encouraged by that. I hope you're reminded that you will be saved by nothing but the grace of Jesus.